I just want to put in a content warning for this video. I'm discussing a memoir that deals heavily with transphobia, institutionalized torture, particularly solitary confinement, self-harm, and just the general overall oppressiveness of a variety of systems of power toward queer people. So, and especially right now, it is a shitty time to think about how much our society hates queer people. So, if you need to take a break from this video, come back to it later, or not come back to it at all, fine. Good. Do that. Hello, friends and enemies. Welcome to Horror and Inconvenience, where things are usually spooky and always weird. I'm here today, again, on the same day, in the same outfit, to talk about book number 4 of the Read What You Own challenge I'm doing. This one I was reading as an audiobook. I generally read nonfiction audiobooks. In the past, I have been really into fiction audiobooks, but for some reason, I'm in a phase where those just aren't working for me. I'm not processing fiction stories very well through audio. So it's been nonfiction for quite a while. And the latest was Readme.txt, Chelsea Manning's memoir. I just finished that yesterday, and this woman went through it. If you have seen any of my videos, you probably have a pretty solid idea of what my politics are. I'm not super shy about them, but this isn't a channel where I talk about politics. Honestly, I don't consider myself expert enough to really weigh in a significant way that can add to or change the conversation. Except for, when I'm with a group of my friends and we're 3 or 4 drinks in and we start to talk about who would do what job on the commune. I'm not the person to ask about most of this stuff. I mostly listen. But Chelsea Manning is a fascinating figure, and yeah, I don't really think she did anything wrong, and I think she was deeply hurt by a lot of the forces of our society that hurt a lot of the people I know. So I know there are a lot of non-Americans in this YouTube community, and even though Chelsea Manning's pretty famous, I don't actually know how famous she is worldwide. But basically, she was in the military. She worked in military intelligence. And this was around 2010. She realized that the media narrative at home was not matching up with the reality of what American troops were doing to the people of Iraq and Afghanistan. So she decided to release a huge cache of information she had on what was really going on in the war via WikiLeaks when she couldn't get any reputable reporters to take the story. And she was court-martialed, tortured, and eventually imprisoned for, I want to say, 6 or 7 years, just for releasing this information, which, as far as I've been able to discover, harmed the United States' reputation, as well it should, but didn't lead directly to harm to any individual person on the ground with the military or any person from the regions we were occupying who was aiding our military. I say our military as if I think we should have a military. Listen, it's really complicated. That's why I talk about books here. It's about as close as I'm comfortable getting, I used to do some political writing, and then several years later, I went back and looked at my articles and realized all of my opinions had changed drastically, and I was super embarrassed about what I'd written before. And since then, I'm trying to leave myself more room to change my mind and be flexible. And, putting some of this stuff on the internet forever it just feels like almost like a form of stubbornness to me. So I'm not doing that, but just know I have a lot of sympathy for Chelsea Manning, and I don't think that what she did was wrong. Even if she had done something wrong, though, even if she had committed a serious crime and hurt people seriously, the way she was treated was inexcusable. So her memoir is the story of a young trans woman who, due to neglect from her family and society, ended up unhoused and joined the military in a combination of genuine belief that she could be a positive force in a war effort she saw as, as something that needed to be addressed. And she felt that she could do her part personally by joining the military. But also, it was a way to get food and housing and money, none of which she had access to otherwise. So, it's one of those double-edged swords of, how much can you consent when the alternative is a life of extreme deprivation? But she certainly doesn't see it that way, at least not the way she portrays herself in her memoir. She seems, although she later regretted it, she seems to really stand by her choice at that time to join the military. So she suffered a great deal socially and psychologically under the Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy, which, for any of you who don't know, was a policy of so-called tolerance that was really very deeply queerphobic in the United States military. It was put in place in the 90s as an alternative to an outright ban on queer people in the military. Essentially, the idea was queer people could be in the military as long as they didn't come out and nobody in their unit ever found out. Apparently, essentially, as long as you were extremely aggressively closeted, the military would tolerate you. Obviously, this hurt a lot of people very deeply. It wasn't really different, in essence, from the previous policy of an outright ban, because if you have to be deeply closeted in order to join the military, well, that was true when queer people were banned from the military as well. Honestly, really what it was a policy of saying the quiet part loud. The Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy has only been repealed for a few years at this point, with queer people openly serving in our military, except, of course, for that time that Trump reinstated the ban on transgender soldiers. Basically, and I know this is going to be a shock to you, queer people's rights are an ongoing issue in the United States, and the military is behind the times. Anyway, Chelsea Manning suffered deeply under this policy because she was a closeted trans woman. And she was attracted to men, so she was in a bit of a double bind. She couldn't talk about her relationships because she was presenting as male and only attracted to men. And she couldn't talk about her identity because she began to know more and more in this time that she really was a woman. So it was a whole thing, and it was extremely psychologically taxing for her. At the same time, she was beginning to lose belief in her cause when it came to military intelligence. So eventually she did release the information on WikiLeaks, although it was a number of months before the data cache was actually found and released by the people who ran WikiLeaks. When it was, she was court-martialed and held in solitary confinement for months while she was waiting to be returned to the United States to face her trial, although she didn't know that. She was never told why she was being held, and she had absolutely no information, no contact with anybody but the guards around what was essentially a cage that she was living in, which, of course, led to severe mental deterioration, as solitary confinement always does, because it's torture. Sorry if I'm getting a little emotional. This was really hard to read, and to be reminded that this is happening to an unknown number of people all across my country right now. But yeah, so eventually she was returned to the United States, where she faced her court martial and was sentenced to 35 years in prison. She was outed by a journalist during her trial, but directly after the trial, before going into prison, she came out for herself and demanded gender-affirming treatment from the United States military, something she had to aggressively legally fight for the entire time she was imprisoned. After, I want to say, 6-ish years, as he was about to leave office, President Obama commuted her sentence, and she was released, but not until after 3 attempts at suicide and going on a hunger strike in order to force the government to allow her to get gender-affirming surgery. So it's the story of someone who's marginalized by a society that insists on using people like her, in this case I mean trans women, as a scapegoat, and a society that won't create a place for her to land, who tried nonetheless to contribute to and improve that society, only for her conscience to make it impossible to live under its strictures. Manning tells her story with a very military style and very computer nerd style straightforwardness. And she reads the audiobook herself. So hearing all of this stated matter-of-factly in her own voice is taxing and heartbreaking. But I think this book's a really important read, especially if you live in the United States. I think it's important to get an idea of how some of our institutions work, and to put it very gently, the challenges that attempts at reform can bring up, and just to see how marginalized people are turned away at every turn. It's important reading, even if you think that Chelsea Manning did something wrong, which a lot of people do. I think it's important to read her story, not only to get the facts straight on the story. Of course, it is still the personal experience of one person involved, but also because I think it's an important American story, and it's an important story of a queer person's life. And Chelsea Manning's very young. She's only, I want to say, 2 or 3 years older than me. And she's got a full life ahead of her, where I think she'll go on to do some important things. Although, if she wants to rest, that's fine too. She's been through so much. Anyway, yeah. Chelsea Manning's memoir. That shit really gotted me. Um, so, yeah, if you've read it or are reading it, I'd love to hear from you. I don't know anyone else who's read it yet, and I would love someone to process this with because I'm having feelings.